This is Lindsey O'Donnell Welch with Decipher, and I'm joined today by two analysts with Mandiant. And we're going to talk about some new research that Mandiant released this week on the Sandworm group, now known as APT44. So, here with me today is Dan Black, Mandiant Principal Analyst with Google Cloud, and Gabby Roncone, Mandiant Senior Analyst for the Advanced Practices team with Google Cloud. Dan and Gabby, Sandworm has been around for more than a decade. It's been affiliated with the Russian GRU, but Mandiant this week graduated Sandworm into an official APT group. Can you tell me a little bit about the decision process behind that? I mean, the group's been around for 15 or so years. Why now, and kind of what went into that?
I can start if that's okay. Um, so the Mandiant graduation process is this very unique analytically rigorous process that we do and we've done since APT1 to essentially look back at all of our threat groups that are related to a certain threat actor and do a rigorous deep dive on each one of those threat groups, try to understand the historical activity that we've seen and the current activity that we're seeing, and tie them together in order to graduate them into an APT. This is something that gets kicked off when we believe that a threat group is especially deserving of the higher threat assessment kind of associated with the title. So for us, Sandworm was this group that obviously has been incredibly active over the last 10 years since we've been tracking them, but has been sort of the primary sabotage unit, cyber sabotage unit for the Russian military intelligence since the war in Ukraine started. And when we saw sort of the prominent role that Sandworm was taking in Ukraine, and we were also undergoing so much of our own research in Ukraine with incident response engagements and such, we believed that we needed to undergo the graduation process as well to make sure that our understanding of that group was really as in depth as it could be. So we spent over a year going through every single cluster of activity we thought might be related to Sandworm in the past and the present. And we were luckily able to tie those major historical um, incidents to the group that we are now seeing in Ukraine.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the advantages of having an APT designation like this and how it fits into giving threat intel that's associated with this group's activities more context in the future?
Yeah, so I think to reflect a little bit on what Gabby said as well, the process of graduating something from an UNC to maybe a temporary name that we give something. So Sandworm was very much a temporary name that we had designated. You can think of the step to take it to an APT as us reflecting a very deep level of understanding and confidence in what we were talking about, right? And so this is kind of like the latest stage of a process for us to say, hey, this is a very high severity threat. This is something that we have a very refined understanding of, and we want to make sure that our customers, the public, are understanding that threat in the same way that we are. And so a lot of what we try to do in this report is write something that will hold the test of time to really contextualize what we've seen from a group over the past decade, its proclivities, its tendencies, what it likes to do, the wide scope of activity that it partakes in, right? In hopes that that'll help people understand for their own threat models for the next decade in terms of what to expect when they should think that they might be in the targeting scope of this group, and what they should think about seeing in their networks if that's the case.
Right, right. Now, when I'm writing about these threat actors, I always kind of like to go down history lane, and Sandworm has an absolutely extensive history, in part because they've been, behind high profile attacks, but then also, in the 2010s, it was really crazy to see these types of attacks where the group was using such destructive types of malware. So from your vantage point, looking at, anything from kind of the In Destroyer Ukraine electric power grid attacks to kind of the NotPetya malware attacks, what have been some of the more pivotal moments over the years of tracking Sandworm from a threat intel perspective?
I feel like we can both take this one because I
Yeah.
feel that we'll maybe we'll have the same answer. Maybe we'll have different answers. I feel like with this group, everyone sort of picks their own thing that they really enjoy tracking. Um, I guess the most obvious sort of pivotal moment to me is their movement into wartime operations. But I think that even though our classification of the Russian war in Ukraine kind of started on February 24th, 2022, um, the really disruptive attacks in Ukraine started after the invasion in 2014. Um, you know, a year after the invasion, you have the first blackout with Black Energy 2 in the Ukrainian power grid, and then almost exactly a year later, you have the next one with Indestroyer. It seems like this group has been able to propel itself forward by actioning these really specific, sort of like high level mandates that align really strongly with the Russian the government interests at the time. Um, and you see them just be active in every single geopolitical event that Russia seems to be having high stakes in. Um, but kind of going off of that, you don't necessarily see the wartime pace of activity and just the rapid adaptation um, prior to 2022 than you do in wartime. So it's been really interesting to see how this group that's sort of been at the forefront of a lot of these novel operations that seem to almost like push the line in the sand a little bit for what we see as norms in cyberspace over and over for the last 10 years, and then just suddenly ramping up their efforts very significantly during wartime.
Yeah, if I could reflect on something Gabby kept saying there, novel, first, innovative, right? All these concepts and the fact that they've often been the first mover in the threat landscape for some of the most brazen and reckless things we've seen, right? The first group to try to disrupt an energy grid with manual interaction and then with custom malware to do that. The first to do this, brazen case of digital election interference in 2016 with the U.S. elections, then trying to double down with that in 2017 in the French elections, right? The petty disruption of an Olympic Games in 2018 because they weren't allowed to participate under their national flag, right? It's a series of firsts in this space. And the thing that really drove us to want to report on this in depth is the proliferation risk we see from some of that, right? When you have a group that's moving first, that often means that there's lessons to be learned to identify from what they've done. And the challenge that we see is when they do those kind of things is that other countries that are developing cyber attack programs, non-state actors who want to cause a little bit of chaos, they have this body of evidence to learn from because they're so forward-leaning in terms of the risk appetite. Their willingness to act is unparalleled, right? I think when you see other countries talked about in terms of developing cyber attack programs, they tend to do this in a test range or a test environment, something where they can collect the evidence they need but not expose it to the world. It almost seems like, over the course of 10 years, Sandworm APT44 has participated in what's equivalent to live fire exercises. They've just done it in the real world with no concern for the downstream risk, the second order consequences of what they were doing, right? The proliferation risk from this stuff, whether you think about back to 2015 when they first used Indestroyer, to some of the stuff that we reported on just last year about that they used in October 2022, the microscata, the living off the land attacks against OT technologies. They're the first ones to take these steps, and other folks are going to absorb some of those lessons, iterate, adapt from what they've done, and they just make the threat landscape a little bit more dangerous every time they do that.
I think also, just to quickly jump in as well, one of the things, kind of building on Dan's point here, that we found really interesting looking at Sandworm's wiper operations, even from the beginning of the war, is that they went from using these wipers that we call multifaceted. So they have different components to them, they can do multiple things outside of wiping, to these pure wipers and moving into the pure wipers, I guess, are just wipers that wipe. Like they aren't setting persistence, they have no network communications, they're not really doing anything other than to just be a lightweight tool to cause some disruption. But they're also moving into using sort of like fake ransomware. And you kind of see like echoes of ransomware tactics in some of Sandworm's operations too, which I think goes along with the brazenness of the actor, but also that bit of proliferation risk that Dan's talking about, right? Like, not only is Sandworm learning from um, ransomware actors that are causing real time disruption in hospitals, in um, very high risk environments, but they're also teaching the other APT threat environment how to do that as well. So it's a very interesting it's a very interesting situation.
Yeah, that is an interesting kind of dynamic. Now, in more recent years, I know that you guys have done a lot of kind of research into what some of the activities of the group have been, especially as it relates to both the war with Ukraine, and Gabby, you had mentioned a little bit of that before, but then also kind of some of the espionage activities that they've launched even outside of that situation. So, and that was also highlighted in your research this week. And one thing that stuck out to me has been this shift, a little more towards espionage efforts that was kind of outlined in the research. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're seeing there with the group? Because like you said, there's a lot there in terms of kind of both using destructive malware, but then also having these other elements to its attacks. And I think espionage is, one very interesting area that this group has carved out.
Yeah, I can take a first stab at least. So I think one of the interesting things in thinking about Sandworm's operations or APT44's operations from the beginning of the war until today is that Russia's war aims, what they've tried to achieve during the war, have evolved over that time, right? I think we all understand from reading all the different things that were out there that Russia thought it was going to win a very quick war at the beginning, right? They thought this thing was going to be over in a couple of weeks, and so they kind of threw everything against the wall, right? We saw this mass wave of disruptions, all kinds of different wiper malware being used, and a really really high intensity campaign of operations in those opening months of the war, right? Um, After the first few months, it started to become very apparent that this wasn't going to be a war that was going to end overnight. That it was going to be a longer war that they were going to have to settle in for the long term. And so in that adjustment, in terms of Putin, the Russia, the understanding that the war aims had fundamentally changed and what they could achieve had changed, we started to see a shift in the types of operations we saw from Sandworm, right? And I think it's been very instructive to see that as they settled into thinking this is a long war, that this wasn't going to be a war that moved rapidly from one front to another, but that the front was going to move inch by inch. That they really settled into thinking about targeting mobile devices, about the platforms, the networks that are being used on the front line. So it's not necessarily about the enterprise networks that we saw them targeting in the beginning, the 2022, but really more towards the high value targets near the front lines, ways that they can influence the outcomes of the conflict, right? And I think they learned very fast that being able to collect that intelligence in different forms from the front lines, that tactical type of intelligence, has a real benefit to the conventional forces, right? So Russia has this thing they call reconnaissance strike complex. It's about how do you pull data in to be able to support targeting all the different kind of outcomes on the front ends of the battlefield. They've really shifted towards that outcome at this point in time. So I think understanding what we're seeing here is really about understanding the different contours of the conflict and how they've learned to adapt, to innovate, to absorb lessons into how to best support a long war as their wider war aims changed.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting you mentioned that, kind of the context there too, because I do feel like there is so much kind of geopolitical history that goes into not just this, the more recent years, but just Sandworm and its activities over the past decade or 15 years. So I'd imagine kind of having a deep knowledge as researchers and analysts like of these different pieces of context and understanding kind of the motives behind what Russia's doing or like why it might be doing one thing or the other, also plays into a lot of how you view these different activity clusters. Yeah, I'd imagine there's a
Yeah.
lot there.
One other point I would make is that before 2022, we had never seen a high intensity armed conflict like this with cyber operations supporting it at the scale, the intensity that we've seen, right? And so the change that we've seen from 2022 to 2024 is in part Sandworm learning how to best do that. If there's one thing that's true about this group is that they tend to have more operational experience than anyone because they've been so forward leaning over the years. But the strategic context of an armed conflict is so different than the things that we've seen the day to day, and they really had to change the way they needed to operate to be able to support that environment when they're no longer in a kind of standalone role doing things like NotPetya, but trying to support the movements of conventional forces on the ground inside a theater of war. Right, very very different outcomes. And no amount of theory is going to make you ready for what that's going to be like in practice, right? And so, there's this steady evolution, adaptation. Gabby alluded to this, right? That learning process that's going on throughout the course of the war. They're doing that, and it's our belief that 2024 they're going to look very different than they did in 2023 as well. That learning process is still ongoing, and they were on the defensive in 2023 from many senses. Russia's going back on the offensive, so that may change the scope and the type of operations that we may see in the future as well.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, well, finally, I wanted to mention, in the research that you talked a little bit about the adoption of personas. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but these identities that essentially um, is the group creating these identities on Telegram channels or other areas to claim either responsibility for various disruptive wartime operations or to kind of add that extra psychological emphasis to amplify its attacks. And one kind of persona that was mentioned was the army of Russia reborn. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing with these personas and how they've been adopted by Sandworm slash APT44 throughout kind of the research that you've done on them?
Yeah, so Sandworm slash APT44 has been using personas for a very long time. They have always had a really interesting blend of different types of operations that they conduct. So we consider Sandworm and APT44 to be a full spectrum threat actor. And what this means is that they conduct disruptive operations, espionage operations, but also these influence operations. Um, and these types of operations often are used to support each other for that psychological effect, right? Um, with APT44, you might hear the name Decipher 2.0 and have nightmares about 2016. I don't know actually how widely Decipher 2.0 was tracked, but at least when I was a researcher in 2016, that name made my ears perk up. So using these personas in cyber enabled influence operations allows them to take their operation to almost like a different audience, create additional impacts, and really kind of show off their own successes or perceived successes, right? Those goals, those aims are basically what's happening here, but in a different context. We have seen three primary hacktivist personas since the war began in February 2022, but Cyber Army of Russia Reborn is a particularly notable one because of how closely we've linked this group with actual APT44 disruptive operations. In one case, we saw a mismatch essentially between a hacktivist, I guess, car posting a claim for a wiper operation before the wiper operation actually successfully was deployed. So there's clearly a very close coordination between APT 44 and Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. Um, there are several different reasons why Cyber Army of Russia Reborn may be utilized in this way. They could be used in some cases to sort of take the effects of the war off of the front and make them amplified into civil society, especially since a lot of these wiper attacks aren't actually hitting military targets. They're hitting government and civil society organizations for the most part. So, Cyber Army of Russia Reborn also has elements to it that, you know, even though they're coordinating with APT44, they are definitely doing some weird like DDoS stuff that who knows if that's necessarily tied to APT44 or not. So we have to be a bit careful with our assessment there.
Absolutely. Okay. Great. Well, thank you both so much for coming on. Especially as we continue to look at where Sandworm and APT44 is going in the future, should be really interesting to see how this group continues to evolve. So, Dan and Gabby, thanks again for joining me today.
Thanks for
Yeah.
having us.
Yeah. Thanks
Thanks.
so much.